a lovely, comfortable car to drive.
I just get a shiver down my back. It's a great car.
When you're driving it, you feel like Lord of the Manor, you know, people start to call you Sir.
I may be biased, but I think this is a beautiful looking car.
What girl could ask for anything more?
Richard and Alan Jensen were both car enthusiasts in their teens. They actually started building cars in their backyard in their spare time. And the first one they built was called the Jensen Special No. 1. And it was put together with bits and pieces that were given to them by all their friends in the motor trade. And that really got the bug going. They were bitten. So the Jensen brothers joined a company called Edgbaston Garages in Birmingham, and they started in the coach building side of the business. They became so involved with this business that the directors actually invited them to become directors themselves. In 1934 it became Jensen Motors Limited. The actual business was still very much a coach builder, and it was a commercial coach builder, so they were involved with any sort of commercial vehicle body that you could imagine. But the Jensen brothers were enthusiasts for the motor car, and particularly sporting motor cars as well. And they started work almost immediately on the prototype of their ideal sports carriage. Within 12 months, the first production Jensen, which was called the S-Type, was actually a reality.
This is a 1938 Jensen 3.5 litre S-Type. Most people, when they see the Jensen, have no idea what it actually is. A lot of people think it's a pre-war Jaguar. The radiator looks a bit like a Mercedes. The body looks like Jaguar or Alvis. The wheels remind you of a Bentley. I think the Jensen's basically plagiarised the best features of other vehicles and put it together as one. Back in the 1930s, the kind of people that bought a car like this must have been either very rich or gullible, because the price was about £750, and for less than half of that you could have had the Ford on which it was based. However, you wouldn't have got the style and the charisma which goes with this car. Jensen's raided the Ford parts bins for anything they wanted other than the bodywork. I may be biased, but I think this is a beautiful looking car.
The S-Type was unique in that the attention to detail that was put in by the Jensen brothers and their coach building expertise really made it a very special motor car, and because of this, style became very much a byword of the Jensen motor cars in years to come.
A friend of mine told me that he'd seen this car in a scrapyard, and I just bought it as seen for £350. Restoring the car was a real labour of love, in that it took me 7 years from actually amassing all the parts to having it on the road. Like many pre-war cars, the steering was very heavy and dead. And I thought to myself, what would Jensens have done back in the 1930s? The answer is that I've looked around for a suitable Ford component. I spent a lot of time looking around scrapyards at old Ford vehicles, and eventually I found the ideal steering box, which was from a scrap Ford Transit van. The overall impression when driving this car is of the smoothness and easy running of the Ford V8 engine. The engine is really the heart of the car. It also makes the beautiful noise which only a V8 can produce. I really like this car, and unless my fortunes took a disastrous turn, I think I will be keeping it for a long time.
During the war, like most other British manufacturers, Jensen had some unusual jobs to do in the war effort. They actually produced bombs, they produced bomb crates, they produced turrets for tanks. After the war, Jensen had a lot of projects in the pipeline, and they wanted a designer to help them with these projects. So Eric Neal joined Jensen's drawing office. One of Eric Neal's first projects was the Jensen Interceptor. This Interceptor was powered by an Austin engine. Austin had just merged with Morris to produce BMC, but there was still a lot of internal rivalry between the two companies. And of course Morris had produced the MG sports cars. So Austin approached other manufacturers to design a sports car for them, and indeed it became a bit of a competition. Jensen produced a prototype of the sports car for this competition, but at the motor show at Earl's Court in 1952, Leonard Lord, who was the boss at Austin's, decided on the spot that the new Healey was to be the new Austin sports car. This wasn't a total disaster for Jensen though, because the new Austin Healey was very much coach built, and Austin didn't have the capacity to actually produce it in any great number, so Jensen got the contract to build it. This new contract also gave the Jensen company financial security, so they immediately started thinking about a successor to the Interceptor model, and thus the 541 was born.
This is a Jensen 541R, 1959. It was the exhibit at the 1959 London Earl's Court Motor Show. Specially set up for the show, the colour scheme, which was chosen by Alan Jensen himself, who had a lot of opposition from his staff. Most of the people objected to the fact that he was going to use a two-tone pink and red carpets, and it caused an argument within the company, to the extent that Alan Jensen said to the staff, well, I'm the boss. He said, I'll have what so-and-so colour I like. I saw early pictures of it back in the 50s, and when I saw those, I really made it my ambition to own a 541. I was at one show, I went up to collect my trophy, and over the loudspeaker, the organiser, he said, you may not particularly like the colour of the car, to the general public. And he said, but at least you won't forget it. It's a typical 50s drive. It's a tiny bit agricultural. Well, you couldn't do a three-point turn in it in a narrow street for a start. That's way out, you know. And but it's nice. It brings back memories from those days, and the sound is very good. But when you're driving it, you feel you feel like Lord of the Manor. You know, people start to call you sir.
The first 541 was notable for having glass fibre bodywork, which was pretty well unheard of in a production motor car at the time. The 541 series was steadily developed through the 1950s, and indeed innovation was the 541. It was the first car to have seatbelts as standard equipment. It was the first car to have four-wheel disc brakes.
I actually got struck by lightning once, and there was a storm, and lightning struck, and it flashed around the bumpers of the car, doing no damage, and then veered off. The lightning shot off and struck another car coming in the opposite direction and caused some damage to that. So maybe it was something to do with the fact that it's a fiberglass build construction that helped it. One of the interesting features on the car is the front flap, which opens and closes. It's manually operated. There's a handle inside which you operate. Open it up if the engine's overheating at all or running hot. It's interesting when you pull in for petrol and things like that. You know, you could never do a quick pit stop in the filling station because whoever's there will want to talk about the car and ask you the usual questions. Sometimes they like to look under the bonnet. The car's won probably about 80 or more awards, some at national level, quite a lot at club level. It takes up a lot of my time, so yes, I suppose it is a way of life really now.
By the beginning of the 1960s, the Jensen brothers were aware that the market was changing, and the 541, the lean and lithe and very fast 541, was not what the market was wanting. Therefore, in 1960, they introduced the 541S. But this car was much wider, it was much heavier. It also had an automatic transmission, but the edge had been lost and the performance wasn't there anymore. The Jensen brothers were fully aware of this and started thinking about a new model that was going to restore everything that the earlier 541 had been. In the early 1960s, Jensen was still, by industry standards, a very small manufacturer, but that didn't stop them producing an all-new model to replace the 541S. This was known as the CV8.
25 years ago, I was in the Air Force, drinking in the officers' mess at Oakington, and one of the chaps burst in and said, one of the guys had just bought himself a Jensen CV8, and we all thought, what is a Jensen CV8? Never heard of it. We all went out with our pints in hand, literally, and stood in the car park, and he drove round the car park and drove across in front of us and did what one should never do to an automatic. He blipped the throttle, at which point the car took off across the front of us, went up the curb, into the rose bed, and sank gently to its back axle. We all said, terrific, and went back into the mess. We actually put our pints down and came out and pushed him out. But that was the first Jensen I ever saw, and that was a CV8, and I thought, what a magnificent bit of kit. The car that I own was produced in 1963. Its performance is startling, I think one could say. Its top speed is about 135 miles per hour. This performance comes from its Chrysler 6-litre engine. When the car was first produced, there wasn't a big enough British car on the market, so they went to the States and brought back this huge power unit. This is not just a standard CV8, it's the Sedanka CV8, which is the only one they actually built. It was built from ground level up. It wasn't a converted CV8 saloon. The original owner requested that he had a half top, if you like, so it was half cut off, so he could roll it back and be open to the skies. And the other addition he wanted was a little dicky seat in the middle of the two front seats, which is really quite sweet. I've owned old cars all of my adult life, and this feels and looks and smells like an English car, thoroughbred car should look like, and that's what I like about it. There's beautiful lines. The front, to me, is shark-like. It's very sharp and harsh looking. I think it's a very masculine car, and that's one of the reasons I like it as I do. One can own the car, use the car, don't be frightened of giving it a bump, because you think, God, that was £5,000 worth of paintwork. It's not that the Jensen is not like that. It's a good, strong car. It's not a difficult car to maintain. Eric Neal designed the car. Before he died, he actually saw it. I took it to one of the Jensen meetings, and I didn't recognize him. I didn't know who he was at the time. And he came across and said, I designed that car. And the delightful thing was he then brought out, oh, does it still leak in the right-hand hood? And are the windows still stiff to wind up? And is there a lot of noise coming from the hood? And I said, yes, it does. It has all of those attributes. He said, it did when we produced it 35 years ago. And as you know, since then, he's died. So I think it was a delightful little episode that I treasure, really very pleasant.
As it happened, the CV8 model was the last Jensen model that the Jensen brothers were directly involved with. They intended to replace the CV8 with another car which was codenamed the P66 and was to be a smaller, more sporting car than the CV8 was. While the Jensen brothers and Eric Neal had actually brought the P66 program up to the prototype stage, certain other areas of the Jensen management, including the chief engineer Kevin Beattie, had actually accepted a proposal from Touring of Milan for the new Jensen. And it was this Italian design that was to become the new Jensen Interceptor. the Jensen brothers effectively felt that they had no say in their own company anymore. 4 weeks after Eric Neal left, the Jensen brothers left.
It's a Jensen Interceptor Mark III, and I love it to death. I think it was aimed basically at somebody who wanted a car with style, for comfort, with speed. You put your foot down and you've got the boot. You can go. Simple as that. The engine's 7.2 litres, but I love the noise, the burble, and it's the twin exhausts, but it's just the whole thing. I just love being in my car. And people do tend to stop and look, especially because it's a woman driving. Gets up some fella's nose, which is quite nice. I was in a traffic jam and this gentleman was beside me, and I could feel these eyes burning holes in me, and I just turned and looked, and he went, so I said, thank you, and then he went, and I went. I pulled up a bit, and there he was again. This happened about 5 or 6 times, so in the end I wound the window down and I said, is it me or the car? And he said, both actually. It has been suggested that the large back window could be used as a greenhouse and you could grow tomatoes in a grow bag quite nicely. It's a great all-round view, you can see anything and everything, it's brilliant. The downside is the petrol consumption. It is, to say the least, excessive. I mean, I think on a really good run, if I'm doing a long run down the motorway, you can get 14 miles to the gallon. But around town, 10, 12, it's thirsty. Sometimes I actually feel as though I need a petrol tanker running alongside of me, just to keep it going. They have a habit, really, of overheating. I mean, I have actually overheated myself when I worked in London, and I blew up outside the office. All the hoses went, which wasn't funny. Clouds of smoke and steam everywhere. But it has now been cured, and we've got the vents in the top of the bonnet, which allow air circulation, and 2 huge fans in the front of the engine, behind the radiator grille, which switch in automatically. There is a book apparently that is concerned with recipes for cooking things like salmon, chops, fried eggs on the engine. Apparently a small salmon would take about 10 miles, 10 to 12 miles, and then you leave it to rest for 5 minutes, and then it's cooked.
The new Interceptor was introduced at the Earls Court Motor Show in 1966, but as well as the Interceptor, there was the Jensen FF, and this was the most innovative new car that any British manufacturer had put on show in many years.
The four-wheel drive concept came from Harry Ferguson, who designed the tractors. Jensen always looked for innovation. They wanted to be the first in any type of vehicle. They produced the first fiberglass vehicle, they produced the first car with standard seatbelts, and so they wanted to produce the FF as a first four-wheel drive production car on the road. A lot of people actually believe the car to be an Interceptor when they first see it. The FF is different. It has twin air intakes to the side, which is probably the most visually different part of the vehicle. The other part is that it's got an additional 5 inches in length. That enabled Jensen to fit the differential, the area which creates the four-wheel drive mechanism. The four-wheel drive meant that it actually became the safest car on the road of its era. You had 33% drive to the front wheels, 67% to the rear wheels, and with that it meant perfect road holding. You could go on a skid pan and you would not be able to skid, you wouldn't be able to wheel spin. So it's almost impossible to lose the car. For me, it started back 1967 with Dinky producing a model car that I actually found on the brick wall outside of my parents' house. Some child had obviously lost it, and it was a little yellow FF. From that day I decided that I was going to buy one, and so I had to wait about 30 years, but after that point I got it. When we bought this car in Wales, it was at an auction. It wasn't very much to look at the time, and we took it up to the car restorers. 2 days later we went up, and my heart really sort of fell through the floor, because I was told that what had I actually bought, it was a wreck, and the wings were fake. It just wasn't a Jensen as such, and I went away quite miserable. About 2 months later, when the car was actually finally stripped to bare metal, I got a phone call to say could I come up and have a look at it. When I went round the front of the car, they showed me the wings. There were no welds in them, and with big smiles they said, well, it's not fake, and it is actually Vignali panels, and you have got a car that's one of the very first 16. After that, we did a bit more investigation to discover that it was actually the first production vehicle to be built in Italy, and it became something that was a bit special.
The FF model continued in fairly limited production up to 1971, but the Interceptor model went on to be the most successful Jensen ever. And then after the oil crisis of 1974, the Interceptor models, they got 10 or 12 miles to the gallon, were proving unpopular. And in 1976, that was it, Jensen were finished. The receivers were called in. Certain financial guarantees had been withdrawn, and the receivers tried unfruitfully to revive the company. Sadly, that was the end of the Jensen mark.
I actually feel that the government of the day could have stepped in and helped a little bit. It's a beautiful car, it's a hand-built car. It's a car with style, with panache, has so much going for it compared to the Euro jellies of today. When I look at that badge, the J badge, it stands for J for Jan and J for Jensen. I just get a shiver down my back. What girl could ask for anything more?